Thanks, Michael, for the introduction. Thank you to all of you for coming out this evening to hear the talk. Just to say a little bit more about myself, I retired from the psychology department at Goldsmiths a few years back now, and that gave me finally the time to write the book I'd been wanting to write for a very long time, which is this one. Obviously, I'm going to try and sell the book tonight, aren't I? That's what I'm here for. They didn't really want to go with the rather naughty title, but that is the title. Again, and that's not to kind of, I don't want to give the impression that I don't think this is a serious topic, because I actually do, but also you can have a lot of fun with it as well. So as you can see there, the book's been out for just over a month, and it's essentially intended to be a reasonably engaging and accessible introduction to the topic of anomalistic psychology. I think Michael deserves some congratulations there for pronouncing anomalistic correctly, because not everybody does. I do quite often get introduced as an animalistic psychologist, which is kind of close, but So first question then is, what is anomalistic psychology? I mean, the most concise summary is what you can see there as the title, but this is the rather wordier definition that we have on our unit's website, and I think I'll probably use that one in the book as well. Anomalistic psychology may be defined as the study of extraordinary phenomena of behavior and experience, including, but not restricted to, those which are often labeled paranormal. It's directed towards understanding bizarre experiences that many people have without assuming a priori that there is anything paranormal involved. It entails attempting to explain paranormal and related beliefs and ostensibly paranormal experiences in terms of known or knowable psychological and physical factors. So you can probably see from that definition that it's a rather skeptical approach to the paranormal. The working hypothesis of anomalistic psychology is, we're going to say, let's just assume that paranormal forces don't exist. If they don't, how can we explain the weird experiences that people definitely do have, and all the kind of associated beliefs in those kind of areas that people have as well? So, as I say, the overall thrust, most of what we've done over the last couple of decades or more has been very much focused on that kind of skeptical approach. But for me, an important part of skepticism, and skepticism is at the heart of the scientific method, an important part of skepticism is to always be open to the possibility that you might be wrong. New information may come along, new evidence may come along that makes you have to revise your opinions on things. And so in that spirit, there's also been a lesser strand of our research over the years where we have directly tested paranormal claims. And I want to cover both sides of our research in tonight's talk. So I'm going to start off by giving you a few examples of attempts to directly test paranormal claims. Okay, and I'm going to start off with this guy, the baby mind reader, Derek Ogilvie. As you can see, this was in 2006. Derek was riding high. He had a book out. He had a series on Channel 5, which is the only TV channel to be named after its number of viewers. What he would do, his USP, his unique selling point, was that he claimed that he could actually read the minds of babies, hence the baby mind reader. So this was before they could even talk, okay? Now you might think, well, what's a baby going to be thinking about? Is it basically going to be, I'm hungry, or oops, I've just pooed myself? I mean, what's it going to be? Well, no, apparently, according to Derek, these children seem to know an awful lot about the state of the family business, repairs that needed doing around the house. They were really, really interested in the family car, as you will see. Amazing stuff. Now, on the program, on the series he would do his readings for people. Well, he'd be reading supposedly the baby or the toddler's mind, and the parents would be there present. And that's a big problem from a skeptical point of view, because there is a technique known as cold reading, which you can learn about, you can buy books, you can teach yourself how to do this, whereby you can convince complete strangers that you know all about them. And if you want to set yourself up as a fake psychic, that's a very useful set of skills to have, okay? Now, I'm not saying that Derek was a deliberate con artist, but it's quite possible that he may have been picking up on some of the same kind of information, and that was influencing his readings. He gets the reactions from the parents as they're standing there, and that kind of shapes the interaction. So, the obvious thing you need to do is to, if you want to test this, is to see whether we can actually cut out any possibility of cold reading. Now, this was 2006. In 2007, Channel 5 decided to make another program about Derek. This time it was called The $1 Million Mind Reader. Now, that title refers to the fact that back then, the late, great skeptic James Randi had $1 million on offer for anybody who could demonstrate psychic abilities under properly controlled conditions. And obviously, somebody at Channel 5 had thought, this would make a really interesting documentary. Let Derek go for the $1 million, hence the title of the program. And also, so that meant they were going to be flying him over to Florida to be tested by James Randi, but they also wanted us to test him before he went. So we agreed to do this, the APRU, this was myself and Chrissy Wilson. And so just to be clear, if Derek passed James Randi's test, he would receive a cool $1 million. If he passed our test, he would get a nice cup of tea and a biscuit. And obviously, both tests had to rule out any possibility of cold reading. Now, the obvious way to do that is to get him to do the reading without the parents present, okay? So that's what we basically did. So for the APRU test, he did readings for 6 children, aged between 15 and 30 months, without the parents present, but with a registered childminder present, okay? And this is obviously all being filmed. The parents were then invited back the next day, and so there are 6 readings. They don't know which of those readings has been done for their child. But if Derek can really do what he says he can do, there ought to be one reading that stands out as having lots of detailed, accurate information about their household. So that was basically the test. We said to pass the test, 4 or more parents would have to choose the correct reading. We weren't asking for 100% accuracy. 4 out of 6 would have been passing the test. Ogilvy apparently, on his way down to Goldsmiths, as he was being driven down, he was asked what he thought about the test, and he referred to it as, I quote, a piece of piss, which is a charming British expression for easy peasy. Okay. Now, one interesting thing happened while he was doing this set of readings. At one point, he kind of departed from what he'd been instructed to do and started doing a reading for the childminder. And that was quite interesting because basically she was very impressed by his reading, but of course it didn't rule out the possibility of cold reading again. So, how did he do in the actual test? Well, this is an extract from one of the readings he did. This was the reading he did for, I'd say it's only an extract, it was much longer than this. An example for a 2.5-year-old girl. And according to Derek, the child was telling me about a car. The following could be associated with 1 or 2 cars. One car has had a wheel or tyre problem on the front driver's side. This is associated with a dark colour car. There's also a scratch or sticker on this car on the lower part of the windscreen. She's got an eye for detail, this girl. On the lower side of the driver's windscreen. There's also been problems with that car with the rear driver's side tyre and a brake problem. On the inside of the passenger seat, there's a mark or tear beside the handbrake. I told you she was good on detail. A door handle doesn't seem to be working all that well either. There's also a noisy exhaust. The child mentioned that there's an issue with a car getting into first gear with a parent. 2.5 years old. Right. Anyway, okay, so how did he actually do then? Only one of the 6 parents chose the correct reading. And that's what you'd expect on the basis of chance alone. So no evidence there of any kind of psychic ability. And poor Derek was literally in floods of tears after the test, crying his eyes out, saying, "That's it, my career's over now." And I'm there saying, "No, don't worry, your career's fine. Your fans won't take any notice of us, And he is still practicing as a successful psychic. He then flew over to Florida to be tested by Randy, failed that test as well. But just to throw a crumb of comfort to the believers, the documentary makers decided that it would be a good idea to have him attached to an EEG machine to look at his brain waves, and it was announced that he had very unusual brain waves, as if this in some way proved that he really was psychic, which of course it doesn't at all. Anyway, so that's one example of a test of psychic ability. Here's a pretty different one. This time, this is a guy called Chris Robinson, who is a self-styled dream detective. Now, Chris is one of quite a lot of people who claim that their dreams foretell future events. And usually the problem with trying to test these kinds of claims is that the people who are having the dreams don't know when the events are going to happen. So it might be the following week, or it might be 20 years' time. So obviously that makes it very, very difficult to test. What was interesting about Chris was that he claimed that he could dream to order, so to speak. So that if you said to Chris, "Right, we're going to take you to a mystery location on Saturday. You keep your dream diaries for the week," because that's how he operated. He kept these very, very detailed dream diaries. Every time he woke up, he'd write down in great detail his dreams. And then come Saturday, we would take him to the location, and he would say there would be amazing correspondences between the dreams he's had that week and the place he's been taken to. Now, that's good, because you can test that. Chris's dreams were sometimes literally true, and sometimes they were symbolic representations. Now, you might think, well, that makes it much more difficult to know whether he really was onto something or not. To be fair to Chris, the symbolic representations were pretty consistent. So he did a lot of this at the time when the IRA were letting off bombs all over the place. And if he ever had a dream where snow was falling, that meant to him that an attack was imminent somewhere. If there were dogs in the dream, that represented IRA terrorists. Okay, so there was a kind of consistency there. Okay, so this person, Professor Gary Schwartz of the University of Arizona, did some tests with Chris where, along the lines I've just mentioned, where Chris would keep his dream diary and then be taken to a mystery location. And Schwartz was very, very impressed. He thought there were all kinds of correspondences between the contents of Chris's dream diary and the mystery locations. The problem with that approach is that it doesn't take account of what's called subjective validation. Subjective validation refers to the phenomenon, if you expect there to be correspondences and connections between this very rich stimulus and this very rich stimulus, there's a good chance you'll be able to find some. So Chris's diaries, as I said, contained a lot of information. And if you choose an interesting mystery location to go to, there's going to be lots and lots of features in the environment around you. So, look at the triangular structures over there, and you mentioned triangles in this dream, and you talked about water, and there's a river over there. You could find things. But is that just coincidence, or is it really some kind of evidence of psychic ability? Well, we wanted to try and come up with a way to control for that. This was for another documentary for Channel 5. I mean, I shouldn't mock them, really. They paid my mortgage for a long time. So, now, what we decided was it wasn't good enough for Chris to be the one, or even one of his strong supporters, to be the one who was saying, "Oh, yes, there are amazing correspondences here." We wanted to try and get a more objective assessment of that. We wanted a third party to do the assessment, somebody who wanted Chris to be correct, but basically, as I say, not just on that kind of a rather sloppy way of judging things. So we came up with a novel way of testing this. We decided that we wanted somebody to come up with a set of 6 possible target locations, preferably all very different from each other. And Chris wouldn't know what the set of target locations was. I wouldn't know either. The only person that would know is the person that Chris had nominated to be the one who would make the judgment. That had to be somebody who wanted him to succeed. And the person he chose was the person who was making the TV documentary, a lady called Leslie Caton. Now, obviously, from Leslie's point of view, she's making a documentary to see whether Chris really has these abilities. It would be a much more dramatic and sensational documentary if he passed the test that had been co-designed by a skeptic rather than failed the test. So she would want him to succeed. And he chose her. They were happy with that. So the idea was he kept his dream diary for however many days, and on the day that he was due to be taken to the mystery location, Leslie would interview him, and anything she wasn't clear about in the dream diary, she could ask for clarification. And then when she'd done all that, when they'd discussed it, she knew how he worked. Sometimes it was symbolic, sometimes it was literal. When she'd done all that, then she would make the decision as to which of the dreams in the potential target pool was the best match for the contents of Chris's dream diary. It was only at that point that we actually made the selection randomly as to which target it would be. So I thought it was a really kind of neat design. There was no chance of any bias other than at that point where a dice was rolled and we decided, okay, what's going to be the actual target. We did 3 trials, 6 potential target locations on each trial. So that means that if you got all 3 correct, that would be really impressive. There'd be 1 chance in 6 times 6 times 6. I don't know what that is, but it's quite a big number. So how did he do? Well, here's an extract. And again, we're just talking extracts here because Chris had a lot of information in his dream diaries. But this is an extract on trial 1. He says, paint, white sheets painted all white. In the dream, it wasn't my house. It was a person I knew when I went to school who was an artist. He could paint and draw anything. So painting is like a key word, if you like. You've got to choose from your pool of places which one you think that little lot matches the best. Now, it just so happened that in the target pool, one of the potential target locations was this place, the House of Dreams. This is a house that's owned by an artist, and he puts all of his artwork up all over the walls, and people can come in and walk around and look at his artwork. So this seemed like the perfect match, really nice correspondence there. But the question then was, well, was this actually going to be the target? And we rolled the dice, and no, it wasn't the target. The actual target was the Ice Bar in London. This is a bar where everything's made of ice, okay, as the name suggests. Now, the thing is that with the logic of the experiment, even though at that point we knew he'd got it wrong, we still had to take him to the location. Otherwise, it would undermine the logic of the design. And what's more, Chris insisted on being blindfolded for the journey to the target location because he said, not unreasonably, if I'm not blindfolded, I might pick up on information en route, and that could contaminate the dream. So he had to be blindfolded. So we ended up in this situation where, again, remember, this is all being filmed for a documentary. Taxi pulls up, a blindfolded man and myself get out, and I lead the blindfolded man up the street. Nobody in London bats an eyelid. Just into the ice bar. We take the blindfold off, and Chris immediately decides, well, it was a hit after all, because I said, didn't I? I said white snow. And now, if you look at that picture, you can see that the ice is actually transparent and the walls are grey. So no, Chris, you can't have that one. That is not a hit. Okay, how did he do on the second trial? Here's an extract. This was an observer dream, so I'm watching other people. It's not as if I'm part of it, and I'm rolling or unrolling something. That could be, if you're in a printing works, it could be rolls of paper. Somebody's now made a pie, so it could have been pastry. And we then put this pie in the oven, and there was a joke about not putting the oven on for too long so you don't burn it. And I see these faces of people go past me. Now, this was a much harder one. There were no obvious matches, as far as Leslie was concerned, in her target pool. She did pick up on the reference there to printing works, and one of the targets in the printing tool was this place, St. Bride's Crypt, which St. Bride's Church has a long historical association with the printing industry, with journalism, and so on. And so she thought, well, that's the best match I can come up with. So that's what she said was the best match from the 6. We then selected what the actual target was going to be, and this time it was a city farm. So this time, not only do I have to lead Chris blindfolded down the path into this city farm, I actually have to get him up on a horse before we can take the blindfold off. But to his credit this time, he didn't try and claim it was a match. So for the third, he's failed 2 trials already, so he's failed the task already overall. But we carry on and did the third trial. Here's an extract. In this dream, I'm in a sort of room, and there are people that are sort of people, and points to his dream diary. And there in big letters I've put dead. It's in this room. There was actually glass cups and glasses. Now cups is always the same. Cups, if I see them, means dead people. And if we don't go where there are dead people, I don't know what all that was about. Now, because Chris hadn't, the target location in the previous trial was not St. Bride's Crypt, Leslie had left it in the target pool. And this time, it did seem to be a good match to what Chris was saying. So St. Bride's Crypt was the best match. And indeed, on this occasion, we rolled the dice, and it came up as St. Bride's Crypt. So he got 1 out of 3, okay, but far from statistically significant. The final example I'll give you, and these are all very kind of different examples. This was related to a study that was reported back in 2011 by this guy, Professor Darrell Bem, who is a very famous professor of psychology, and unusually for a psychologist, he's actually very sympathetic towards the paranormal and towards parapsychology. Back in 2011, he published a paper with the main title, Feeling the Future. It was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which is a mainstream psychology journal, not a parapsychology journal. It involved 9 experiments, and 8 results appeared to produce evidence for psychic abilities. There was over 1,000 participants in total, and the results seemed to suggest that people could, in some way, sense future events before they happened. So, as you might imagine, the world's science media really picked up on this. It was reported all over the place. Bem even appeared on chat shows in America. You know, it was very much kind of in the mainstream. Got loads of coverage. As you might imagine, the skeptics came up with critiques of various aspects of the methodology and the stats and various other things. But to Bem's credit, he said he wanted other people to replicate his results. And he was even prepared to provide them with the software he'd used to run the experiments to make that easier for them to do. And as we all know, we're always being told that replication is the cornerstone of science. So this is a good thing. Bem's trying to get people to replicate his work. We thought we'd give it a go. We being myself, Richard Wiseman, and Stuart Ritchie. We decided we'd each attempt a replication of Bem's experiment number 9, which was the one with the biggest effect sizes, so we've got the best chance of being able to replicate the effects if they are real. I must admit we had an ulterior motive. We're all skeptics, all 3 of us. None of us expected to replicate Bem's results, but we did think this would be a relatively quick way of getting a paper into a top-class journal. That's what we were trying to do. Anyway, let's see how that worked out. Let me describe what the experiment was. It was on what Bem called the retroactive facilitation of recall. Now, I'll explain with the help of this diagram. According to Bem, even if you don't practice rehearsing, say, a list of words until after you have been tested on them, you will still perform better on words that you practice than the words that you don't practice, even though the testing took place before the practice, before the rehearsal. Now, that's real Alice in Wonderland stuff, okay? But that's what he claimed his results showed. If this was true, it'd be great news for students. You sit the exam, and then you do the revision afterwards when you know what the questions are. I mean, it'd be great. It does tend to suggest it doesn't actually work. Anyway, this was how the methodology. 48 words were presented one at a time on a computer screen. There's then a 5-minute free recall period where they type in as many of the words as they can remember as possible. And then half of those words are randomly selected and presented again for further processing, in other words, rehearsal. And according to Bem, in some mysterious way, this rehearsal can reach back in time and affect your performance at the time of testing. Well, we didn't. None of our 3 independent attempts to replicate those results produced results in line with what Ben was reporting. We wrote our paper up, we sent it into the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and the editor rejected it without even sending it out for peer review, basically saying, we don't publish replications, we're too important for that. And we argued a little bit with him, said, come on, this got reported all around the world. If it's not a real effect, that's important. But no, he would not be moved. We tried 2 other high-impact journals, and we got the same treatment. No, we don't publish replications. What's all this stuff about replication being the cornerstone of science? You try and get a replication published. Obviously, at least back then, things have improved. And we were getting actually quite a lot of attention from people for the fact that we couldn't get our paper sent out for peer review. We weren't saying it should automatically be published. We were just saying treat it like any other paper, send it out for peer review, see what our peers think. So Ben, because this revealed a real bias in science publishing. Certainly, as I say, back in the day when we were doing this. Ben Goldacre picked up on it. In his Guardian column, the New Scientist commented on it, the Psychologist. We were kind of getting more attention, more fame for this than I get for most of the things I do publish, which is a little bit embarrassing, really, but there you go, you know. Anyway, it reveals something about the sociology of science. The British Journal of Psychology did send it out for review. They sent it out to 2 referees. One of them loved it, said, yeah, publish it. It's great. The other one, nah, he wasn't too keen. And we kind of thought from the comments we could figure out who this second referee was. We thought it was a certain Professor Darrell Bem of Cornell University, the very man whose results we had failed to replicate. And we said to the editor, look, there's a clear conflict of interest here. Bem confirmed it was indeed him. And we said, just send it to a 3rd referee, let a 3rd referee decide. Nope, wasn't having it. So that we eventually published it in PLOS One, which is an open access journal. And that proved to be quite a good move because that meant anybody could read it without having to pay for a journal or to pay anything. And it was getting about 1,000 views a day at one point, which is a lot for a science paper. So that was kind of a good outcome. And again, this whole debate that this was part of, whether there's a publication bias in the journals, especially the top journals, and yes, there absolutely is. This then fed into an ongoing debate about problems of replication in science generally. Parapsychology has huge problems with replication, but psychology has its own problems as well. Some of the results that have been published in standard textbooks for decades, because we all thought they were real effects, turn out probably not to be. They're not replicable. So that fed into that ongoing debate, which was, again, another positive outcome. Okay, now, I still occasionally get asked by people, very rare these days, actually, to be fair. Used to happen a lot more in the early days. Why are you doing this stuff? We all know people aren't being abducted by aliens. We all know that ghosts don't exist and people don't have psychic powers. Well, maybe, but I don't think that's a properly open-minded scientific attitude. As I said before, I would agree with all those statements if you want my personal opinion, but I may be wrong. So I think to be properly open-minded, you can't say we know these things are impossible. We might not be convinced by the evidence that's put forward, that's fine, but we don't know. Though even more important than that, for a psychologist, the fact is that these kinds of beliefs and experiences are reported in every single society, everywhere in the world throughout history. Now, that either indicates that maybe paranormal forces really do exist, and at least some of these claims can't be explained in terms of conventional scientific concepts, or it's telling us something really interesting about the way our minds work. And so either way, it's worth taking them seriously. Okay, so that's my kind of general approach on these things. Okay, I'm now going to talk about the other side of our research, where we kind of look at what psychological factors may be important in making people maybe sometimes think they've had a paranormal experience, when maybe there are other factors involved that explain it more plausibly. So we'll have an interactive bit. Bed, snore, dream, doze, pillow, snooze, blanket, night. That was fun, wasn't it? Now, one of the things that we've got very, very interested in is memory. Because usually when you're dealing with someone's claim to have had a paranormal experience, you're not dealing with the actual experience or the event itself, you're dealing with their account of it. So how accurate is eyewitness testimony? Well, I'm sure you're all very, very familiar with the fact that there have been literally thousands of studies that have looked at the unreliability of eyewitness testimony. You do things like show people a video of, say, a staged crime and then ask them to describe what they've seen. And eyewitness testimony can be notoriously unreliable. It might be slightly more surprising that even eyewitness testimony for very simple stimuli that you have seen literally thousands of times in your life can also be very unreliable. How is the 4 represented on clocks and watches with Roman numerals on them? Is it like the clock there on the left, I, or is it like the clock there on the right, IV? How many people think it's I? Put your hand up. I see a few hands going up. How many people think it's IV? Okay, definitely more hands. Now, obviously, I'm a tricksy psychologist. I wouldn't be asking you the question if you were going to get it right, would I? So it's the people who said I who are correct. And that seems quite surprising because surely 4 in Roman numerals is IV, which it is everywhere else apart from on clocks and watches. I know there are a few exceptions to that, but there are only very few, but you don't need to email me about Big Ben. I mean, what that is a very simple demonstration of the fact that very often when we're asked to recall something, memory doesn't work like a video camera. You couldn't think back to the last time you saw a clock or a watch with Roman numerals and zoom in on the 4 and answer the question. You answer in terms of what you think you must have seen. And so what do you think you must have seen? Well, 4 in Roman numerals is IV, isn't it? So that's the answer you give. But actually on clocks and watches, it almost always isn't. It's I. So it's a very simple example of what we call the influence of top-down processing, when your beliefs, your knowledge, your experience can influence, in this case, memory, the way you think the world works, which is sometimes, usually right, but sometimes wrong. And it also can influence perception, as I hope to show you at the end. So that's one example of kind of the unreliability, of eyewitness testimony. I'm going to ask you to do a little task here. I hope this works, because I honestly haven't tried it with an audience before. So here we go. What I want you to do, when I start this little animation, these letters will move around the screen. I want you to count the number of times that the white letters hit the edge of the screen. Ignore the black letters, okay? So let's see how this goes. If I can... Oh, I need to find my cursor, which is it's probably up there somewhere. Oh, hang on. Aha. Right. Okay, how many times did the white letters hit the edge of the screen? Anybody? I thought it was 12. I'm not absolutely 100% sure, but that really wasn't what that was about. Did anybody notice anything other than letters moving around the screen? A red cross. Now, this is the bit where I want some people in the audience, to be honest, put your hand up if you didn't see the red cross. Thank you. I appreciate your honesty. I really do. I really do. Right, okay, yeah, there are a few hands went up there. That was a demonstration of what's, for the people who didn't see the red cross, it's an example of what's called inattentional blindness. The classic study to demonstrate inattentional blindness, which is probably more fun than the one that we just did, this was published in a paper by Simons and Chabris back in 1999. They had a little short video film, some people in white T-shirts, some people in black T-shirts, throwing balls to each other. You had to count the number of times the people in the white shirts threw the ball to each other. And halfway through their video, someone in a gorilla suit walks through the middle of the group, stands there beating their chest, and then walks off. And about half the people who are doing the counting task do not see the gorilla. And that is a very counterintuitive result. You think, no, it's bound to grab your attention. Something so incongruous, something so unusual. No, about half the people miss. So hence the wonderful title of their paper, Gorillas in Our Midst. I thought that was inspired. Now, my wife, who is also a psychologist, Anne Richards, she's done a lot of research on this phenomenon called inattentional blindness. Okay, it's called inattentional blindness. And it's a really important phenomenon because a lot of fatal accidents are caused by people not seeing what's directly there in front of their eyes. And as I say, Anne had done a lot of research on this, and she called me one day to ask if I had a measure, a pencil and paper measure, of the personality dimension of absorption. Now, if you score highly on a measure of absorption, then you are the kind of person who, when you're watching a film or reading a novel or doing a crossword puzzle, you completely shut out the outside world. You become completely absorbed in what you're doing. And it sounded intuitively as if that ought to correlate with susceptibility to inattentional blindness. Now, I was intrigued because I knew from my wider reading that absorption correlates with paranormal belief and reports of paranormal experiences. So we thought, well, let's look at all of those things in a single study. So we published this back in 2014. We used the letters task that you've just seen. I mean, it's conceptually equivalent to the gorilla video, obviously. Our gorilla was the red cross moving across the background. We set it so that about half of the people who did the task didn't spot the red cross. And it turned out that those people who were inattentionally blind, those who didn't see the red cross, did indeed score higher on absorption and higher on paranormal belief and experience. And again, firstly, it's another example of the unreliability of eyewitness testimony. If you don't actually see something and pay attention to it while it's happening, it will never be in your memory. You can't retrieve it if you didn't process it and pay attention to it at the time when you saw it. It's just not there anymore. But also it suggested that at least on some occasions, I mean, not all by any means, but maybe sometimes there might be a mundane explanation for some apparently paranormal event. Suppose in a hypothetical example, somebody is in a room, they insist that they were the only person in the room, and while they weren't looking, a book moved from one side of the room to the other. And you say, well, yeah, maybe there was somebody else in the room with you and you just didn't realize they were there. Oh, no, I'd have seen them, wouldn't I? Well, would you? I mean, people don't see a gorilla. It's possible. Another memory effect that we're interested in is this one. This is, does anybody not know who this is? Can you put your hand up if you don't know who that is in the picture? Okay, this is Uri Geller, who first appeared on the scene in the UK back in the early 70s. And I was a complete believer in all this stuff then. I was in the sixth form at school, and when he appeared on the scene, I was so excited. He claimed he could do these amazing psychic feats. He could read people's minds. He could divine the contents of sealed envelopes. But the thing that really seemed to catch public imagination and the media's imagination was that he claimed he could bend metal just by gently stroking it. And so he became known in the papers very often. They'd be referred to as Uri Geller the spoon bender. Okay. Now, it turns out that I now know I've got a lot of friends who are conjurers, and they can do this trick where it looks as if they're just gently stroking a fork or a spoon and it just seems to melt in their hands. And they say it's a trick. It's sleight of hand. It doesn't involve any psychic powers whatsoever. And if Uri's doing it using psychic powers, he's doing it the hard way, because it looks exactly the same when you do it as a trick. And it's probably worth noting that Uri's never been able to demonstrate this under properly controlled conditions. But there were some people who said, well, no, that can't be true, because I saw him doing this back in the 70s. And the thing was, after he had finished bending the spoon or the fork or whatever it was, he put it down, and it carried on bending when he wasn't even touching it. So how do you explain that as sleight of hand? That would be tricky. I mean, these days, apparently, you can buy gimmicked forks and spoons from magic shops that will do that. But back in the day, you wouldn't have been able to. So what's the explanation there? Well, This was something that my friend Richard Wiseman looked at. Richard is a pretty famous psychologist and skeptic, but he's also a member of the inner magic circle. Not just the magic circle. Richard is so damn talented, it's the inner magic circle. And he thought this was probably just down to the power of suggestion. But rather than just asserting that, he wanted to demonstrate it. So he did this nice little study where he had two groups of participants, showed them a video of an alleged psychic who was in fact a conjurer using sleight of hand. And the important part came after the conjurer had bent the key using sleight of hand. He puts it on the table, and in one condition, you hear him say, if you look closely, you'll see it still bending. The other condition, the other participants get exactly the same video, but they don't get that verbal suggestion that the key carries on bending. Of those who do get the suggestion, 40% report that they think the key carries on bending. In the other group, virtually nobody does. So it's a really big effect with a really simple manipulation. And Richard found that across two different studies. We borrowed the video for our study because we were interested in a phenomenon called memory conformity. If you have a single eyewitness account, then you probably won't give that as much evidential value as if you've got multiple witnesses and they're all giving very similar accounts. And that's probably quite a sensible thing to do. But one thing you should bear in mind is that when people witness something unusual, they will discuss it with each other. And they'll do that maybe before there's any kind of formal interviewing from anybody, from any investigators. And if one person is giving their account, it can influence another person's memory. And so if that person has something that's wrong, they've made some mistakes in terms of their eyewitness account, that can actually affect somebody else. They'll pick up on and incorporate that same mistake into their own recall of events. And everybody's being totally honest and trying their best to be accurate, but that's the way memory works. So we wanted to look at this memory conformity effect. So as I say, we used Richard's video. This was with Chrissy Wilson, this study published in 2014. We got people to watch the video in pairs and then discuss it with each other after they'd watched it and then report back to us independently. And what the real participants in the study didn't know was that the co-witness was a confederate, a stooge, working with us who had been instructed to either say during the discussion, yes, it did carry on bending, or no, it didn't. And what we found was that had an additive effect. If you were in the condition in the experiment where you got the suggestion from the psychic, stroke magician, and you got the reinforcement from the co-witness, we got up to levels of 60% of people saying they thought the key carried on bending. It absolutely didn't. And so what that shows is that it's not just what happens while you're witnessing an event that's important, but also what happens afterwards can contaminate your memory. Okay, you knew this bit was coming. Which words were presented earlier? Okay, so put your hand up if you thought snore was presented. Okay, you're correct. Chair? Nah. Pillow? Yeah. Dream? Yeah. Night? Yeah. Sleep? Ha, gotcha. Sorry. That is a very trivial example of a false memory. All the words that were presented were very closely associated with the word sleep, but the word sleep itself wasn't actually presented. As I said, it's a very trivial example of a false memory, but it's a false memory nonetheless. You thought a word had been presented and it hadn't. But we've now got techniques that can actually implant false memories for entire episodes of things that happened, well, or rather, things that didn't happen. And initially you agree that didn't happen, but by the time we've finished playing with your minds, a sizable minority of the volunteer sample will become convinced that they did happen and often have detailed memories to back it up. And that includes things like, there's lots and lots of examples, but just give you a few. Getting lost in a shopping mall when you were about 5 years old and being very upset about it. Or being attacked by a dog when you were very young. Or spilling a punch bowl over on the bride's parents at a wedding reception. Or, this is quite an impressive one, being involved in a serious crime during your teenage years which had police involvement, and you were the criminal, you were the perpetrator. And people start off kind of completely denying this, but by the time the psychologists have done their work, a lot of the people, I say it's a sizable minority, it doesn't work on everybody, but a sizable minority are saying, yes, I remember it now, this is how it happened. Scary, what? We've now got to the point where we can say, okay, so is there a certain kind of personality profile that is more susceptible to false memories? And it turns out, yes, there is. There are various variables that appear to correlate with susceptibility to false memories. They include things like dissociativity. Rather than give you a technical definition of dissociativity, if you were the kind of person who would score highly on this measure, then you would be the kind of person that my grandma would have described as being away with the fairies, okay? A related kind of, these are all kind of closely related kind of personality dimensions. Fantasy proneness. Are you the kind of person who has a very, very rich fantasy life? Often very, very creative individuals. Absorption, I've already talked about. Hypnotic susceptibility. Are you a good hypnotic subject? All of those things intercorrelate with each other. They also correlate with susceptibility to false memories. But what was particularly interesting to me is they also correlate with reports of paranormal experiences and with paranormal belief. Now, I'm sure for the people in the audience who are old enough, you'll immediately recognize this photograph. It's a photograph of the planes crashing into the Twin Towers on that horrible day. And if I were to ask you, who were you with? Where were you? What were you doing on that day? I think you'd probably be very confident in the report that you gave. That's called a flashbulb memory. And we used to think, psychologists used to think, that flashbulb memories were special memories that were kind of much more indelible and much more accurate than other kinds of memories. Memories for really, really emotionally, charged experiences and events. It turns out that even those so-called flashbulb memories are not as accurate as we once thought they were. They do tend to be better remembered, but people do make mistakes, and their memories, they do get distorted. Anyway, it looked like we were doing a study of flashbulb memories. We gave people what we called our news coverage questionnaire, our news footage questionnaire. And on that questionnaire, we had 5 items. So we said we wanted to know who you were with, what you were doing, where you were when you first saw these dramatic pieces of news footage. Not when you heard the news, when you saw the footage was what we were interested in. And we had the planes crashing into the towers. We had Saddam's statue being toppled in Basra. We had a couple of others. But one of the items on our list, we were being a bit tricksy, one of the items was something which had happened, a terrorist bomb going off in a Bali nightclub, but it hadn't been caught on camera. And what we found, in line with similar research by other false memory researchers, is that 36 of our 100 respondents said they could remember seeing this non-existent footage. They could tell us whether it was in color or black and white. They could tell us whether there was a commentary or not, and give us various other details about it. Now, this is a false memory of an episode that didn't happen. And as we predicted, those people scored higher on measures of paranormal belief and the tendency to report paranormal experiences. Now, how am I doing for time? Yeah, okay, I'll keep an eye on that. One of my personal favorite examples of what I believe to be a false memory, again, I could be wrong, but what I believe to be a false memory is people who report alien contact, and in particular, being abducted by aliens. We published a paper back in 2008 where we compared a group of people who had conscious memories of having been in contact with aliens with a very closely matched control group that included my mum, who, as far as we know, doesn't claim that she'd been abducted by aliens. And we found that our group of experiencers, that's the politically correct term, they don't like being called abductees, the experiencers scored higher on a lot of those personality variables that correlate with susceptibility to false memories. So things like dissociativity, absorption, tendency to hallucinate, various other things. So that kind of fit with our general approach of wondering whether we might be dealing with false memories in these cases. How do you get from to having those detailed memories of alien abduction? Well, one of the other things we found in our study was that our group who reported the alien contact, they also showed a much higher level of the incidence of what's called sleep paralysis. Anybody not heard of sleep paralysis? Raise your hand, please, if you haven't. Oh, you're a very well-informed group. I think virtually all of you have. But just for anybody that hasn't, if you ever talk about sleep paralysis, you have to show this picture. It's in the contract. It is a beautiful, well, scary but beautiful picture. And it shows a lot of the features of sleep paralysis. It was painted by Henry Fuseli. It's called The Nightmare. Back in the old days, the term nightmare was referring to sleep paralysis type experiences, not just scary dreams. And you can see there in the picture, you've got the horse peering through the drapes. You've got this demon on her chest. And amongst the kind of mild form of sleep paralysis, which lots of people have had, it's very common. It's not particularly anything to worry about. It's a little bit kind of disconcerting when it happens. But it is literally just a temporary period of paralysis that happens between sleep and wakefulness. And it typically lasts a few seconds, and you snap out of it, and you think, oh, that was a bit weird, and you get up and go about your day. But it can be associated with other symptoms that can make it absolutely terrifying. It might just be a very, very strong sense of presence. Even if you can't see anything else or hear anything else in your room, you are convinced that there is something or someone in the room with you, and they don't mean you any good at all. But you might actually hallucinate things. You might hear voices or footsteps or mechanical sounds. You might see dark shadows moving around the room, or lights, or even monstrous figures. You might see demons or old hags. Also, you can see anything that your imagination could conjure up. You also very often will get a sense of pressure on the chest and difficulty breathing. You'll feel as if something is trying to throttle you. And so this picture, as I say, is a really great depiction of sleep paralysis. But again, how do you go from that? Okay, it's scary. I should say, by the way, it appears to be basically that most people never experience sleep paralysis in their lives. Of those that do, it's usually the very mild version. Of those who get the vivid version, it's usually only once or twice in their lives, but they remember it. I've got a whole chapter in there on sleep paralysis, and some of the accounts that I get sent, even though these people know that it's a hallucination, they're still terrifying experiences. But most people only get those once or twice. There are some poor individuals, quite a small percentage, who get the vivid version on a regular basis. Now, if you were in that group, you may well, if you don't know there's a scientific literature on sleep paralysis, you may well get to thinking that either something really weird is happening to you on these nights when it happens, or you're going crazy, you're losing your mind, and that's not a very pleasant prospect. If you then come across a documentary or a book written by a ufologist, the ufologists widely believe that when the aliens abduct you, they are able to wipe your memory for most of the experience. But there might be a few telltale signs. For example, have you ever woken up in the night and found that you couldn't move and had a strong sense of presence? Or maybe seen lights moving around the room or dark. In other words, they're describing the symptoms of sleep paralysis. But to the ufologists, this is an indication that you've been abducted by aliens and they've wiped your memory for the rest of the experience. So, what's the next step? Hypnotic regression. Yes, a lot of people believe mistakenly that hypnosis is a valid tool for uncovering repressed or hidden memories. It's actually not. It provides a context for the formation of false memories based on imagination, expectation, things you've seen in books, read in films, and so on and so forth. So if you go for hypnotic regression, expecting to find evidence that you've been abducted by aliens, there's a very good chance you will end up with detailed memories of having been abducted by aliens. But those memories weren't there before you had the hypnotic regression. If you go expecting to uncover memories of being Henry VIII in a past life or Mary Queen of Scots, then there's a very good chance that that's what you'll end up with. If you go expecting to uncover memories of being the victim of satanic ritual abuse, there's a very good chance they're the memories you'll end up with. You tend to get what you expect to get with hypnotic regression. Okay. Just to finish up with, I'm going to make another theme that runs through anomalistic psychology. I've mentioned it once already, is this theme of top-down processing. Just to put it in a wider context, when you are interacting with the world around you, during your normal waking state, you've got two sources of information that you're using. On the one hand, you've got the information coming in through the senses, and that's sometimes referred to as bottom-up processing. But that information can sometimes be either degraded or it can be inherently ambiguous, and so we also make use of top-down processing. What we know, what we believe, what we expect about the world around us. And you have this constant interaction going on that produces a mental model of the world around you and your place in it. And you're constantly updating that on the basis of new incoming sensory information. What that means is that particularly when the input is degraded or ambiguous, top-down processing plays a relatively larger role in what we experience. And that means that sometimes we can end up seeing and hearing things that aren't actually really there. And one nice example of this is the phenomenon of pareidolia, a type of illusion or misperception involving a vague or obscure stimulus being perceived as something clear and distinct. Now, there's lots of lovely examples of this on the internet. It's that kind of thing of seeing, and one of the things we very often see is faces, okay? We see faces in clouds, in the pattern and wallpaper, in a stain on the floor, and so on and so forth. And for most of us, it's just a matter of, or even the bubbles in your coffee cup, you just go, oh, look, it's a face. You know, you don't make a big deal of it. If it looks a bit like Jesus or the Virgin Mary, and it happens in a church, then people can read great significance into it. But as I say, there's lots of nice examples. I'm going to literally just show you, like there's a good few there, okay? And one very famous example, some of you may remember if you're into this kind of stuff, was the famous face on Mars. Do you remember this? So NASA Viking orbiter image from 1976 picked up that image on the left there, and it led some people to kind of conclude, oh, there must be a civilization on Mars, or in the past there was, and they built this amazing monument. But when they took other pictures, 2001, the Mars Global Surveyor image, you can see that it's kind of, there's not really a face there at all. It's just the tendency we have to see faces in often what's nothing more than basically visual noise. That's the end of the talk. We'll go into the Q&A, but thank you very much for listening. Thank you.